In this video, we will continue our discussion on conditional statements, and we will look into specifically the types of conditional statements. And we are going to be looking right here in how to write what we call the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive of a conditional statement. So technically there are four parts to a conditional, or four types of conditional statements. There's your original conditional statement, there's its converse, there's its inverse, and then there's also the contrapositive, all regarding the original conditional statement. So let's take a look here. In our first type of example that we have a converse. So the converse is if the original conditional statement, so that's what I have right here. This is the original conditional statement. If P, then Q. If hypothesis, then conclusion. It's symbolized as P implies Q. The converse is simply switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the converse would be written if Q, then P. If Q, then P. So let's take a look at an example of the converse before we take a look at the other types of conditional statements. So if we take a look at this initial hypothesis and conclusion that we have, we're going to let P be the hypothesis, you are a guitar player. Let Q be the conclusion, you are a musician. And so we're going to write each of the following. So let's start off by writing its conditional statement, if P, then Q. So if P is a hypothesis, it's going to be if you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. And that's true. I mean, physically think about it. If you play the guitar, you are considered a musician. Well, what about the converse? The converse is Q, then P. If Q, then P. So we're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So it's going to be if you are a musician, then you are a guitar player. But that's false, because if you're a musician, you can play a lot of different instruments other than the guitar. And so the overall statement is a false statement to make. What about another type of conditional statement? The inverse. The inverse of a conditional statement is going to be if not P, then not Q. We did not switch the hypothesis and the conclusion this time, but we negated both of our hypothesis and our conclusion. So that's read, if not P implies not Q. If not P implies not Q. So going back to our example, for the inverse, if not P implies not Q means if you are not a guitar player, then you are not a musician. But again, that's a false statement, because just because you're not a guitar player, you still may be a musician. Maybe you just play a different instrument. And the last type of conditional statement that we have is called the contrapositive. The contrapositive is both the switch and the negation. So it's if not Q, then not P. If not Q implies not P. Not Q implies not P. So we switch the conclusion and the hypothesis and negate both of them. So going back to our example here, so if I'm switching both of them, I'm saying that you are starting with your converse in the switch. So if you are a musician, then you're a guitar player, but then you're negating them. So if you are not a musician, then you are not a guitar player. And that's a true statement, because if you're not a musician, then you definitely are not going to play the guitar. And so the thing that I want us to realize here is, if we notice what's happening between part A, the conditional, and part D, the contrapositive, as well as B, the converse, and part C, the inverse, they are both the same validity, truth value. They have the same truth value. The conditional statement is true, and then the contrapositive was also true. But the converse was false, so the inverse was false as well too. Well, why has it happened? Is there a correlation between the two of them? In fact, they are. we call it logically equivalent. We call it logically equivalent, or you may see it as equivalent statements. The conditional statement and the contrapositive are either both true or both false, just as the converse and the inverse are either both true or both false, okay? I usually like to call it logically equivalent. I always tell my students that it just sounds a little bit more scholarly by saying logically equivalent, rather just saying equivalent statements. So that's going to wrap up this video. We have talked about the now 4 total types of conditional statements, and we have found examples of each of those. And on to the next one.